Not trying to make the world's greatest production here. I'm trying to just get it to where you can follow along with the lecture and hear my lecture. So we're going to talk today about the social goods, the income distribution. I want to go into. Now we're going to talk about some just various issues because we're going to spend the rest of the semester now talking about some various issues, various topics in microeconomics. I think now you have a good basic understanding of microeconomics, some of the ideas behind the microeconomic theory. You're able to follow that. I think you now understand. You understand what a monopoly is, what natural monopoly, what perfect competition is, a little bit of an understanding of oligopoly, a little bit of an understanding. I think you're beginning to gain a deeper understanding of how models work. Now we're going to spend the rest of the semester kind of talking about some practical things. We started talking about social goods before we went off that topic a few weeks ago. I'm going to get back to some of that. And then we're going to go over income distribution. Income distribution is a very important part of economics because we're not just interested in whether society overall becomes wealthy. We're interested in how income is distributed, the income is distributed across a society. For example, you can take a country like Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if you've ever heard of Equatorial Guinea, but it's a country in Africa, and it is near the equator. That's why they call it equatorial. And it's a little country that has a lot of oil, and if they distributed that income fairly, the country would be the wealthiest. The average income would be the highest in Africa. And except for a very small percentage of the population, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. So so income distribution does matter, and we're going to look at the income distribution in Japan, and we're going to be using I'm going to be using data that I got from the housing census. One of the best ways, and it's not easy to do income analysis of incomes in Japan. There's a lot of privacy laws. It's harder to get. Countries like the United States are a little bit easier to get data on income distribution. Japan is a little bit harder, so we have to use data from, for example, the housing census, ask income. So I'm going to make use of that data to look at income distribution. And I'm going to start talking about government expenditure, and I'll see how far I get on the topic this week. What I have now is I need to update it. This is 2 years old now, so it's a little bit old. It's okay. I mean, the general basic things haven't changed, and if I get a chance to update it, depends on how far I get into the lecture today. I may not even get to this topic on government expenditure. So I might have, if I have an opportunity, I'll update that before the next class. So, with that in mind, we'll begin talking about. And you've seen this before. I'm just going to go over. This is we kind of got to this point before we started focusing on some of the models that I focused the midterm assessment on. When I was talking about the public transit as an example of a social good. And social goods I talked about in terms of a park. Government typically provides social goods because in many cases it's difficult for the private sector to make money. And typically the government will provide social goods in such instances. And one of them is public transit. Public transit and much of the public transit is run by government are government-affiliated entities. Even if they've been privatized, they still, there's a lot of government oversight. They still essentially have features of government, of a government agency. And here's the example of JR. Here, this is that's the Tokyo Metro, system. There, a photo. That's the Chiyoda line, by the way. That looks like the Yamanote line there. Those are examples of social goods that are typically provided by the public sector, but it's not. In some cases, there are railways that are constructed entirely by private firms, and so it's interesting to understand how that process took place. Because actually there are numerous examples, and some of the most successful private rail companies in the world are in this country. I personally think that this is a great example. Japan is a great example of how social goods, the country's figured out how to create an environment where private firms can provide a social good and produce, in some cases, a greater social benefit than would have been the case than if the public sector had been involved in the construction. And the reason is that we need to think about how rail lines generate externalities, and in thinking about that, we can think about how a private firm can take advantage of it, and also teach the public sector how to properly think about running a rail. And I say that because, coming from the United States, our public transit systems are terribly run. They lose massive amounts of money. They're not able to take advantage of the externalities that they generate, and basically they just seem hopeless. In my country, it just seems hopeless. It's a hopeless sinkhole of money. So at least personally, in terms of that, I think there's lessons that my country can learn about the way that railways are operated in this country. And I've talked about Tokyo. I did begin to talk about this, so you've seen this before. I won't go over this. I think many of you, you're familiar with the Tokyo line. I just want to go over this very briefly because I think this is important in that this was the density by coup in 1920 in the 23 wards. The 23 wards were the city of Tokyo, considered the city of Tokyo back then. So it's pretty much the same thing. Legally, it's not quite the same thing, but essentially it's basically the same thing. But we can see this very high concentration of population at the city center. And at the time, the rail lines, there were national rail lines, and I believe it was 1904, 1906, the Railway Nationalization Act of 1906. They nationalized a number of private railways and prohibited the remaining private railways from competing with government rail lines. Now the thing about that, well, the interesting thing about that was that that allowed, whether this was intentional or not, and it may well have been intentional. It'd be interesting if anybody knows, has any more detailed information on that. It'd be very interesting to know. But when that happened in 1906, what they did, you had lines, say JR lines that went down in this direction, for example, or out especially to the east side of Tokyo, because that's where the population was concentrated in the city. The rail lines served these areas. It focused on these areas, and there was less service, and in some areas no service or very little service out there. So the public sector said, well, you can't compete with us, but on the other hand, they didn't prohibit them from competing. They didn't prohibit private firms from competing, and in fact, there were private firms. It was basically in areas of the city that had low population, but in fact could have development that were actually reasonable places to live if you could get transit to those areas. They actually left the market wide open. And a company like Tokyo, Tokyo was able to see that there was very low population in this part of the city. You can see these population densities per square kilometer. In this area, just basically 1,000 per square kilometer. You're talking about 16, 19, 26, 23, 43, 25 times more density in the city center. So compared to a heavily populated city center, nobody lived here. These are essentially almost unoccupied. And the government said, well, nobody lives there, you figure out whether there's a possibility. So what a firm like Tokyo could say, well, we can create value. They said we can build railways, and this part of the city needs the service, and we can. And they understood what externalities were. They understood that they could build a line, that they could build lines and create traffic and create a destination. They were good marketers. They were good. They understood externalities. Very, very smart people. I just really, when I read about this. I think I've already talked about this and how Tokyo internalized the externality. You know, the interesting thing, I was explaining this to the chairman of the department. He wasn't aware of this. I said I was explaining this to the students in the class here. He thought that was pretty interesting about that this fact that how that Tokyo had their first development, and it was the perfect timing. The great the Kanto Jishin of 1923 came right at the perfect time for Tokyo. Everybody, you know, it's one of those things. It was a disaster for most people, and there was of course, a lot of deaths and a lot of unfortunate things that happened. But for Tokyo, it was a very positive. It was a very positive event because they happened to have a development. And here I've got a map, and this shows the original Meguro Kamata line that Tokyo built from a Meguro station. I've turned the map on the side. This is Google. I've turned it on the side and I highlighted that map. This is now two different routes, two different lines. Actually, when I first came to this country, it was still the same line. It was still the Meguro Kamata line, and it ran on this route, and it ran on that route, and you could run all the way. Now it goes in different. It's more complicated now. And I actually lived right here in Yaguchi no Watashi station. People think that's a kind of humorous kind of. Whenever I say that, but I actually lived right there for a few months. The first place I lived in this country was there because I actually worked at Meguro Station in Arco Tower there. But and right in the middle is a place called Danshofu. And has anybody been to Danshofu? Anybody ever been there to that station? You know, okay. This is a very I'm familiar with that because I worked on a deal. I did a little bit of advisory work on the sale of a home in that area. And there's some very expensive homes. And this one, they actually spent 1 billion yen constructing this home in the bubble. 1 billion yen. It certainly wasn't worth 1 billion yen when we looked at it. I mean, it had some really. It was crazy. They had stained glass, and it had like a floor that you could dance on. That kind of like it was crazy. You know, they could shook and crazy stuff. And they spent 1 billion yen to build this house. But so I got to know the neighborhood pretty well when I did this work. But it's a very interesting. That was Tokyo's development. That was the development right here at Danshofu. And what they did, and what's significant about that, You can see it's right in the middle of that line, and it's this area here is kind of like, it's a little bit of hilly, somewhat hilly area, and it's overlooking the Tamagawa right there. And they basically made it was low population, it wasn't connected to anything, and they made the connection, they made these connections and created value. And that's what good real estate developers do, is they can understand how to create value. And when you combine the creation of value through development with the development of a rail line, they were able to combine the two and take advantage of that. But what's very interesting about this, as I say, this is the creation of social goods. But if you've looked and you have seen this radial line, that's very clear. If you look on the map, I don't think there's any place else in Tokyo that's even remotely like this area. That is, Dominic, you've been to that state, but this is unlike any other neighborhood that I'm aware of, and I know the city pretty well. And you can see this kind of radial development, radial street layout, and it made use of, it was based on the garden city concept that was developed by an urban planner in the UK, Ebenezer Howard. They have these great names. The British, and they have great names. In the late 19th century, they had some really interesting names. But this was the concept of this kind of radial design, and they had that park was probably part of the original development, and it sloped down to the station right there. There's kind of a gentle slope, and it took advantage of that very high end. They made a very high end development there. But so here's the idea that you're creating a social good while at the same time creating a private good. So they mixed the social and the private and created something of tremendous value. But I do want to emphasize that it is a social good. In the process, they still created a social good that they were able that the government left open, left that kind of part of the open for private developers to go in and establish that kind of a system. I just think it's a brilliant development. It's a brilliant brilliant example. As I say, the production of social goods must be organized by the government in some way. The story of Japan National Railways is interesting because it kind of also shows that sometimes things can go wrong, and especially in a country like Japan, which is pretty heavily, significantly dependent upon rail. Rail is a very important part of transport in this country, and certainly right after when Japan National Railways was established as a public corporation in 1949, you had a situation where it was right after the war. The country was beginning to rebuild from the war, and that type of public service was that type of public social good was very badly needed. Now the problem, and this is an interesting paper. It's actually in English that talks. I think it was translated, but it's a very interesting history. You know, it's an interesting. If you're interested in social goods, I would recommend looking this up, and either in I think it's readily available in Japanese as well. But look up the paper, and if you're interested in the topic of this, I think the story of Japan Railway is a very interesting topic. So according to this Professor Nakamura, Japan National Railways had two objectives by the government, and this is something that a lot of public corporations like this have. One is to be financially independent. There wasn't a lot of money, so they had to basically to earn, to attempt to earn a profit. At the same time, they had to provide nationwide, nearly universal rail service. Well, the problem with the dual objectives are essentially contradictory. They essentially are objectives that, if you're financially independent, that means you have to try to earn a profit. But if you try to provide basically universal service for something like rail, by the time that you're getting in rural areas, you're not going to be earning a profit. So the effort to provide, to fulfill the second objective means that you're negating the first objective. So and the problem was, what you have to do under such a circumstance is you have to have what's called cross-subsidization. And I'll just, let me know, cross-subsidization. Cross-subsidization, you may want to write that up. I'll keep that up on the board, because that's a very important, this is a very important thing when you're providing public services or social goods like this, where you have to have some level of financial independence, but there's a need to provide a universal service. What you do, the idea is that you earn profits in one area and you apply those profits to subsidize areas where the entity cannot earn money, but yet in order to provide the service. This is a model that's very common. And for example, when we've talked about natural monopoly, when we're talking about a natural monopoly, the idea of cross-subsidization is very important because, for example, the telecommunications monopolies were in the mid-20th century at that time were natural monopolies, and so they were private companies, but the government required them to provide universal service. They could provide the universal service and earn enough of a profit. They guaranteed enough of a profit that made it worth it for the company to provide the service, to earn enough profit to keep the shareholders happy, and to provide universal service. So that's the kind of, that's how you achieve that goal. And certainly that was the effort here with Japan National Railway, was that they would use profits in the urban areas, charge a little bit higher, earn profits in the urban areas because they could operate as a monopoly. They were operating as a monopoly in these areas, which the public sector, the law said you couldn't compete with the government along those lines. And then in those local areas that you provide where they lose money, that you at least are able to provide the service. So that's the kind of balance, and that balance is achieved through what's called cross-subsidization. A very important concept when you're talking about social goods and the government providing social goods. Now remember, like a Tokyu doesn't have to worry about that. Tokyu is a for-profit, all they're worried about is making money. Everything that Tokyu did was about making money, and making as much money as they could from what they did. But because of the way they did it, there was a social benefit that the society received from that, where this is a different model where there has to be service provided in areas where it will simply not earn a profit. The problem was that eventually, because early in the post-war, the country was recovering, it was still relatively poor, everyone took the train. So you had a model, if everybody's taking the train, well then there's no problem. You know, you've got plenty, you've got a captive audience, you have what's called a captive audience, people have to take the train, you can price it, and Japan National Railway made money. But the problem is that as incomes increased, rail service What's rail service when you have increasing incomes? It's an inferior good. Remember we talked about inferior goods. Inferior goods was income increases, the demand decreases. Rail service is one such inferior good. In general, as incomes increase, your use of alternative methods of transportation increase. I can assure you, for example, there was a point where I used to make lots and lots of money, and I didn't take the train very often. I took cabs all the time. So it was when you have more money, you do different. You use other forms, and so you had that, and also technological advances reduce the cost of air transport. So as the cost of air transport reduced, then it became more attractive to use alternative methods of transport. And this was in spite of technological improvements in rail technology. There were some fantastic, you've had like the development of the Shinkansen, which was first introduced in 1964. And if you, I know I'm actually old enough to remember the Tokyo Olympics of 1964. It's scary. But that was the first time I ever heard of Japan. I remember on television, the Olympics were on, and it was from a place called Japan. I think around that time I also was watching a lot of Godzilla. I would go with my uncle. We'd watch Godzilla movies at the theater, and I saw it as a child. I saw Tokyo destroyed many times by Godzilla. But at any rate, that was my. that was when I first became aware of that. But that was the year that the first Shinkansen was built, and it was built, in fact, for the Olympics. It was built as part of that. And also very interesting. You may be interesting to note that was a World Bank project. So that Japan received World Bank financing from the World Bank in order to construct the original Shinkansen. So Japan was still developing. At that time, after it was 20 years after the war, but it was still developing, and that was in fact, and now that seems incredible, but that was financed by the World Bank. But at any rate, after 1964, and I remember when I was a kid, you're like the last 10, 15 years, everything comes from, says made in China. Well, when I was a kid, everything said made in Japan. Your toys, everything was all those kinds of things like toys, and they were all made in small consumer items were made in Japan. The country was growing very rapidly after 1964. Growing 10% a year, that was the economic miracle. Rail transport, as a result, because there were substitutes, declined as a share of passenger kilometers traveled from 45% in 1965 to 23% in 1985. That's a big decline. And the population didn't grow that much. Population grew, the country's population was growing during that era, but you're talking about a massive, as a massive decline as a share of kilometers traveled. There was probably more travel, but probably overall travel declined. And as a result, Japan National Railways, which until the mid-1960s was earning a profit, that model that I talked about of cross-subsidization, providing basically universal service, going out that model worked until the mid-1960s. But after that, JNR's operating losses began growing. Now the problem, and this is a problem with many public sector entities, is that in spite of the growing losses, there was still, and they invested heavily in rail infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, and there was a political pressure to expand. you know, there was a political pressure. For example, I can remember, believe it or not, does anybody know of, or you've heard about Prime Minister Tanaka? Does that name mean anything to you? He was Prime Minister in the early 1970s. He was quite a figure here, and I actually remember when he was Prime Minister. I was a teenager, but I paid attention to those kinds of things. But the one of the things that he did, he was from Niigata Prefecture, and he had control. He had a lot of political power in the Ministry of Transportation, and that was the Ministry of Transportation at that time. And he built the Shinkansen. The reason why the Shinkansen got built to Niigata was because of Prime Minister Tanaka. So that's the kind of thing, and I don't think it's ever made any money. You know, it's just the kind of line that you know. I mean, it's nice. I've traveled to Niigata. You know, it's nice to use. I've been to Niigata on business, so it's nice having it. And also, if you want to go skiing, you can actually on that line get off right at a ski resort, as some of you might know. But it's probably doesn't make money, and that was the problem. Is they expanded that kind of so your revenues were falling. The expenditure on infrastructure was continuing to grow. It was a recipe basically for disaster. It was originally covered over by borrowing, but by 1980, JNR's annual operating deficit had grown to 1 trillion yen. So here is the operating, here by 1980. And what's interesting, 1980 is an interesting date because that's really also when Japan began becoming a major global economic power. So Japan's becoming a major economic power, and certainly I became aware, that was when the year that I became really, I became aware that how powerful Japan was, and many of us in the United States were becoming aware of that. But at that time, the problem is that JNR is developing for another era. They were developing the rail infrastructure for another era when everybody took the train, and there were few alternatives. Now there are a lot of alternatives. The operating costs were 4 trillion, operating revenue of 3 trillion, and they had long-term debt of 14 trillion yen. So 14, their debt to operating revenue was four times, and now look what happened. Look what's happening. The operating revenue grows very slowly. There was still inflation. There was still a reasonable level of inflation in the early 1980s. Believe it or not, you guys have never experienced inflation in this country. So the revenue is growing, but watch how the costs are growing more rapidly, and that gap is kind of growing. 1, 1.2, 1.6, 1.7, 1.7, 1.8. Down to 1.4, but this is when they're beginning to realize, uh-oh, this is out of control. This is going completely out of control. The long-term debt, 14, 16, 18, 20, they're also borrowing because 1.7, so it's going to 20. They're borrowing for infrastructure expansion. The debt is just growing, and they have to pay interest. It's spiraling out of control. By 1986, they're realizing this is unsustainable, absolutely, completely unsustainable as an operation. So, as I say, it was both increasing financing costs and to finance infrastructure development. This long-term debt, 25 trillion yen, that's serious. Even today, that's serious money. That's 5% of GDP today. That's serious. That's serious money. It was 7.4% of GDP in 1986. So in response, in 1987, the government decided to privatize it, and JNR was broken into 6 regional companies and a national rail freight company. And one of the things that happens is you create, a lot of times when you do this, you'll see it's like the creation of a good, you'll take some good companies, you'll spin them off, and then you separate out the bad companies, the ones that are losing, the parts that are losing a lot of money. So here's the so here now we can see we're looking at the structure of the liabilities that JNR had in 1987, and this was the situation that they face. As I say, it was from years of overspending and declining revenue relative to expenditure, and really they didn't adjust to it. And as is often the case in bureaucracies in general, it's not just in Japan, but not until it was a crisis was anything done about it. So here are the liabilities. The long-term liabilities, 25 trillion, pension fund 5 trillion, construction 4.5, this island railway company, it must be like islands out in, I mean, complete, probably zero value and lots of expenditure. 37 trillion, 14%, they transferred some of this was transferred to companies that were reasonably healthy. So they transferred that part. And then then the taxpayers picked up 14 trillion right off the bat, as we say. And this JNR Settlement Corporation, this was hoping that they would be able to recover some of that money. There were some land sales, stock share sales. This was the hope that the Settlement Corporation would be able to solve this problem. Now, and this happened at around the time that I came to this country. The three of the privatized companies, the JR West, JR Central, and JR East, were listed on the public stock exchange, beginning with JR East in 1993. JR West took place in 1996. And JR Central was taken public in 1997. Now, as you probably are aware of, you're talking about both Central, West, and East are all lines that are related to Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kansai. So the Kansai, Nagoya region, and the Kanto region were the center. So these were the three. These were the three healthy. These were the healthy entities, and excuse me. Because they were able to, and it was, I think, it was practically done. These were privatized. They were able to operate as for-profit, as a more profitably operate, and use the profits to pay down the long-term debt, so that by 2014, it had resulted in a total reduction of more than 50% of the long-term debt that those three companies inherited from JR. So the long-term debt position was down to 6.43 trillion in 2014. So you can see this is this was, the original was 14.5, and they had a long-term debt of 6.43. So they were paying down. This was a solid situation for these companies. 2014, pretty solid operating incomes. They're earning. All the companies were profitable, and you could really say it's a kind of quasi. Public sector. Then this is an interesting, it's an interesting to look at. And again, if you're interested in the public sector and running public companies, this is a very good, how do you operate companies that still need to provide a social good. They have to be run better than just a government agency that can just spend money without worrying about it. So you have to give them some freedom to operate, but at the same time, it's essentially a public. These are essentially still public sector companies. So this is interesting how You can look, this was Japan, this was the old company, how it operated, and this is the Japan where the various JR, and really a very important, the very important thing. I mean, you have the law, the public corporation, it's corporate status, public corporation, corporation with special status. That's probably not a big deal. The enumerated restrictions on operations. Here it became free. And one of the important things here is that these companies could now set up real estate companies, because one of the reasons why Tokyo, as we saw, Tokyo was essentially a real estate company that used the ability to create a rail line in order to enhance the value of their real estate. So that was the model that Tokyo did. And so what this kind of ability to expand the scope of operations meant that those companies, these JR companies, could begin to operate more. They could establish a real estate branch to be able to take advantage, to try to take advantage and create value, and to take advantage of the value from the externalities. That existed from the running of a rail line. So you remember, you've got you're talking about JR East, Tokyo, JR Central, Nagoya, JR West in Osaka. You're talking about tremendous ability to take advantage of the externalities. So that gave them the freedom to do that. They could decide independently to make investments. Of course, because they were publicly traded companies, now the market was monitoring that, so they had the freedom to do that. The budget, they had this is an interesting one, because as you know, if you're familiar with Japanese politics, if you let the politicians decide anything, they'll usually make a decision to spend too much money. And so this was the budget authority came from the National Diet under Japan National Railway. It went under the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transportation, and this is one of the classic political moves in this country, where the ministry makes sure that they grab control. That basically the ministry took control over these entities because for just purely political reasons, as I mentioned. For example, like Tanaka, Prime Minister Tanaka forcing the construction of Shinkansen to Niigata as an example of that. Now that kind of budget authority, that kind of budget authority was taken into the ministry. Same thing with borrowing and bond issue, national diet and transport. So it's political, the same thing with the appointment of executives. Here's the one: wages determined by law, wages negotiated between workers and management. And again, it's pretty natural. If the wages are determined by law, well, the politicians like their constituents to be happy, and that's fair. You know, politicians want happy constituents. Constituents want to be happy, and happiness is more money. When you're talking about politics and politicians, if anyone does anyone have any personal experience in dealing with politicians or anything? I'd be curious to hear yours. I have a good friend who was his father. I don't know if I've told this story, stop me. But he was a politician in Saitama. Ken, and he worked for his father's. He told me these stories. It was just basically he was his father's. Basically ran the office, and his job was just basically to carry bags of money, to lending and to constituents. I mean, lots. I mean, just sacks, bags full of ichiman. Really? It was real, it was very interesting to hear. And so that's the kind of thing, And that's how you got elected, you got reelected, you kept your, it was just keeping money flowing to, I mean, that's it, that's politics. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just, that was the nature of the beast. But it was very interesting to hear that kind of, that was, that's the way it works. It's money. And at election time, lots of Ichimaen bill, you can't campaign door to door, but you can still get, Ichimaen bills passed around, and so that can, that happens. So you may not be able to knock door to door, but somehow somebody can get envelopes full of stuff with money, so that still happens, you can't stop that. But so that's, so obviously, what my point there is, when you have determined by law the wages are going to be higher. God bless them, they want to keep people happy. But if it's something where you have to run a company, then you get this. So it's obviously, the point is it's all more practical. And here's a very important, the fare determination. The diet determined the fare. Well, any political entity, and I've seen this in the United States, New York City is the classic example. The fares are kept artificially low to keep the public happy. The operating companies went bankrupt. Your transport, your subway, the subway companies went bankrupt as a result. So here the diet was determining the fare. Well, here now it's independent. It's determined more on a business basis. So these companies were able to operate on a business basis, and that's the outcome. The outcome is you've had these companies. You've had some of these companies that were able to spin off, become private, slowly paying down the debt. A lot of the remaining debt, though, eventually the public sector, in terms of the taxpayer, has had to take. That's just an expensive lesson that the country learned as a result of that. I think it's a very interesting story. If you're interested in the public sector and public sector of public companies, I think the Japan National Railway and the Japan Railway System is a very interesting very interesting case study, and comparing that with the way that private rail lines are operated. And I say personally, I think there's a lot of lessons for international. I think this has international implications as well. I think these are some very interesting, these are applicable outside of Japan in terms of running public sector and rail companies well. At any rate, we're going to move on. We're going to now talk about household income distribution. Let's see, we are 50 minutes in. We have 40 minutes to go. We're doing fine. We're going to talk about household income distribution. And it's very important, as I say, it's not just how much wealth the society creates, it's how it's distributed. And part of the stability, if you want a stable society, you're going to be concerned with your income distribution. If income distributions become too unfair, that can cause problems. And that's certainly something in my country, the United States, has some very major problems. It's very unequal income. A lot of people are being left behind, and that's been there's a real major social problem that's developed in my country as a result of that. You've had less of that in Japan, and the reason is because income distributions there's more even distribution of income. So we're going to look at that and see how and see the structure of income distribution. But we're going to see there have been changes. We're going to look at some changes between the late 1990s and recently. And we're going to make use. I'm going to make use of data from the housing census. As I say, the Japan housing census is really the best way. If you want to get income information, you want to get some sense of incomes within cities. Say, if you're interested in what's the average income in Chiyoda-ku, or the average income in Nerima-ku, or in in Nagano Prefecture or Nagano City or any kind of that's that's where you go if you're interested in income distribution and you want to study that in this country. That's the data. I've not found anything better than that. If anybody's aware of something that's better, you know, as I say, I think that's the best source of that. And those censuses are taken every 5 years. And the last one was the census of 2013. That's the most recent one. We're going to come up on another one. Next year is going to be the next housing census. They're done in years that end in 3 and 8. The next one in 2018 next year. But we won't have any results from that until probably 2019 or even 2020, where you'll be able to use that. So this is the best thing we have now, the most recent data. And one of the things is that, and what you do is households report their income. You don't in the housing census. It's typically you take a sample of how. It's not every household. You take it's a sample. And they ask the households that respond to the survey, they ask them whether what their income level is, but it's within a range. It's not. They don't ask the specific income. They say just check a box. What's the range of your income in order to get a higher response? And so we can look and we can see. And one of the important things it's important to remember that we've had both demographic changes and we've had just income changes between 1998 and 2013. That 15-year period, the demographic changes, there was an increase in people got older. So there was an increase in older households. So people retire. Well, when people retire, their incomes go down. So we would expect an increase in lower income in households with less income as a result of that change. Also, there's more single family households. People are marrying later, so they're staying single, and sometimes, in many cases, not married. And that means that you're going to have, even for younger people, you're going to have more lower income households as a result, because if you have 2 income households, those tend to have higher, of course, going to have higher income. Single mothers, there's more single mothers than there used to be. And another change that's taken place is the traditional families. You know, there's the cartoon on Sunday night. It still runs. It's been running forever, I think. But it's a very traditional, the 3-generation family, which is the kind of traditional household in Japan that really is largely disappearing, really. But you know, even 25 years ago, and certainly 40, 50 years ago, was a much more common family structure. You had 3 generations living under one roof. Well, when you have that kind of situation, your household income, of course, is going to be higher. You know, it's a shared income when you're talking about household income. So there's all of those changes have taken place, and we've seen all of these demographic changes. So we have to remember, we have to think about all of the different things that might be driving the changes that we're going to observe in income over that period. We need to keep that in mind so we get it correct and to adjust our thinking to take that into account. So we consider that. One of the things, though, is we look between, and also because of deflation, that meant that incomes, even if real incomes didn't fall, nominal incomes did. And these are nominal. These are nominal incomes, not necessarily real incomes. So in declining prices, your incomes are in nominal terms are going to be falling as well. So with all of that in mind, we can observe that 1998, the lowest income under 2 million yen, 16% of households fell in that category. It increased to 21% in 2013. 27% of households had between 2 and 4 million yen annual income. That grew to 33% in 2013. At the other hand, the 7 to 10 million, that's your kind of upper middle class income, 7 to 10 million. It went from 16 to 11%, and kind of more upper middle, almost approaching upper income, went from 8 to 5%. So when you consider the kind of over 7 million yen, which is your kind of upper middle class, I think you could call it upper middle class. The total in 1998 was 27%, and in 2013 was only 18%. That's a 9 percentage point decline. That's a big change. That's a big decline in income. So when you're talking about, say, top-end housing, residential housing, for example, that's certainly certain pressures in terms of downward pressure on prices, say, in housing, for example. And it also, if you're talking about, say, more single family, that also is a shift. There's a shift. It might also mean a shift in terms of the type, for example, the type of housing that's desired, which is, of course, this is a housing census, so that's part of what the survey is interested in. Here's the overall income. These are the income shares. These are the shares of income. In other words, the total estimated, and these I've estimated. You have to make some estimation, so I've worked with this. This is data that I personally work with, so that's where this is my own analysis that I've done here. But so you have to make some assumptions about income at the top level, because that's just over 15 million. You have to make some guess as to what the average income is in that category. But your income shares for especially for the 2 to 4 million, look at how this increased. 13% of total income in 1998, 21% in 2013. Again, a big shift. And again, here, a similar significant shift, 26% in the 4 to 7 million yen category, 32% in 2013. So what we had are the under 7 million yen, 7 million yen and under, 43% of households in 1998. 15 years later, it's 59%. So 43 to 59%. That's a big shift. Those are just in terms of household income. Those are major. We're talking about some major shifts that have taken place in this era. And similarly, we're looking at the top end. This is now the 10 to 50, the over 10 million yen. That can be considered certainly upper middle income to upper income. So your top end of the income structure had 35% income share in 1998 and only 23% in 2013. So some big changes. The interesting thing, though, is that what's interesting is that there's still more income. The disparity in income is measured by the Gini coefficient. I think we've talked about the Gini coefficient actually increased. So from there you could look at that and say, oh, it looks like that actually there's a more fair distribution of income, but not necessarily. That's not necessarily the case. It's just, but there is a change in the structure. There's certainly these things do suggest that there's just been a big change. There's a lot of structural changes that are going on here in terms of income distribution. And so we're going to try to understand what those changes in the structure might be, what might be driving that. And so then we're going to look at some ways that employment change, household structures change, so we can try to understand what might be driving some of these changes. And one of them is the share of households not in the labor force. That's the shares of households not in the labor force significantly increased between 1998 and 2013. And so when the households that were not, only 21% of households were not in the labor force in 1998. 21% reported they weren't in the labor force. That means that if it was a multi-family household, nobody worked. If it was single, no one in the household worked. 30% increased to 30%. So that's a 9 percentage point increase in the number. So a significant percentage increase in the number of households that decline in company employed, and a 4% percentage point decline in self-employed. Probably a lot of this again is changes in the structure due to the demographic changes of an aging population. No doubt that that has a lot of a role. That's the decline, especially here to here, and the increase from here to here. It's probably just a shift, to some degree it's a shift, just an increase in the number of retirees. But that's still 30% of households. 30% of households are not employed. Well, think about it. Well, who do you tax? That's 30%. You're not going to tax those people. You can get you can get your consumption tax. You know your consumption, your shohizei, you can get that, but you can't get There's no income. They're not earning income. There's still no income tax, and that's kind of one of the reasons why there's been the shift. That explains some of the shift to consumption taxes, because when you have a growing amount of people that aren't in the labor force that are probably retired, you've got to get some way to get revenue, so the government can function. So now what we want to do, now we're doing here is for those people, it's really good data. If you're interested in income distribution, it's fun data to work with because it's a lot of detail. You can do a lot with it. I do like working with it. You know, as I say, in doing these kind of studies of income distribution and all. It's quite detailed, and there's a lot of things that you can do. Which is that if you want to analyze this, say, you know, if you're interested, like in doing a thesis or some kind of graduate work or something, it's a good source. You want to study like the demographics of income change in Japan. It's great. This is you want to familiarize yourself with this data, and as I say, it's kind of fun to. I've always enjoyed working with this data. But so one of the things I was able to do was to focus on those households that aren't in the labor force. So I could look at that and focus on it and see what the income distribution, and see if I get any, what kind of changes might have taken place. And it's actually not, I mean, there's some increase, but it's not that much. And the purpose, I wanted to see, well, if there's some change, that might tell you that there's some change really in the structure. And what we can see is we've got that are under 4 million, it's 82%. 2013 of 79% in 1998. That's probably just due to deflation. You know, it's probably just deflation. What it tells, one of the things that tells me, it's probably, you know, when we've got this 4 that says 15, 14, 4, 3, you know, 2, 1. It's not that much of a difference. So there's not major changes. What this tells me is that these are the same people. It's the same kinds of people. They're just more retired people. Just the driving in the increase in households that are out of the labor force is just simply they're retired. You know, so there's very little change in income distribution there. But where we do see, and again, you can look at household size. Great stuff. I mean, you really can do there's a lot of fun stuff. If you just like data analysis, this is fun. It's, you know, you could certainly, there's a lot of senior thesis topics that are buried in this information. But the household size, look at the change here. This is a big, and as I say, you have, this tells a lot of the story of the demographic changes that have taken place in this country over the 15-year period. And we can see, for example, that the single family, 24% of households were single family in 1998. It increased to one-third. One-third of the households were single family, a major increase. Two-person households also increased, 25 to 28. But your three-person, which is probably in most cases one child, a married couple and a single child. But the big reduction are your over three-person household, 32 to 21%. That means that families with children, a big decrease in the number of families with children, a big decrease also in the number of extended families. To look at the extended families, you probably would have to look at like households with more than 5 or 6 people. You'd have to dig into the data more than what I've done here. And again, if that's something of interest to you, if you're interested in the family structure and how that's changed, that's a good place to find it, is in data like this. But at any rate, even with that, you can see the over three-person. You can see the big. That's a major decline in the percentage of households. And now, and again, it's great. I separated it out by big cities, by major cities in the Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya urban regions, and now you can see where the urban big city change. As I say, this is, if you're interested in demographics and income distribution, all of this kind of stuff, great. It's great data here. But here in the major urban regions, and you're talking about probably 50% of the country's population that's concentrated in these three. Let's see, it's like 30, 50, about 60 million, about half, just under half. Is concentrated in these three urban regions. 27% of households are single family, 37%. So a 10 percentage point increase. 27, 37. You want to just make that, just toggle that back and look at that change. 33, 37, 27, 24. You can see the difference. That's just sitting right there. And a 10 percentage point, 29 to 19. In households with 3 or more. Not, as you see, the big change is the over 3 and single family. I mean single person. That's the big change. And that's the kind of that tells you that the demographic change is more elderly, more retired, living alone, fewer families with children, and fewer extended families. Then we look at the regional cities, and as again, you're able to really break this stuff down in the data. I was able to do some real interesting demographic work here. You can see in the regional cities, though, it's not that much of a change. And you can see that single family. That's a difference, a big difference there. You were talking about Miyagi Prefecture, Niigata. These are focused on. So I did that at the prefecture level. Miyagi, that would be Sendai. Niigata, of course, Niigata, Okayama, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka prefectures. And you were able to get Sapporo. So Sapporo, I was able to. Sapporo is so different from the rest of Hokkaido. You really do have to break that out. But if you look, you'll see that difference. The single family, 25-29. Look how different. 27-37, 25-29. 25-29 in the two-person. See, not much change in the two-person or the three-person. Certainly, and although there is a decline in the 3 and over, but still there's 31. It's 23% of households in these mid-sized cities, 19 in the major cities. Let's see. Oh, and then now we have the other regions. The other regions now. These are the more rural prefectures, the smaller areas, and again, you could really slice and dice this any way you want. I mean, there's a lot, but this is the way that I did. That was the rest of the country. We've got not really much increase, 21 to 24. That's in single family. I mean, it's out there in that big world out there beyond the major cities. The world isn't changing as much. There's some, but it's compared to this dramatic change that's taken place in the urban areas. These major, look at the major. Go back to the major urban areas. Look at those dramatic changes. That 29-27, there was actually more three-person households in the major cities in 1998 compared to single person, and then there was double the households single person to over three in 2013. Where you go there, there's certainly a change. There is a significant change, but it's a lot less. There's still more households with over three persons in these smaller urban regions. So the structure, that means the social, it tells you the social structure is completely different. It's a completely different social structure out there, as you would call in the provinces in this country. It's a very different, world out there. It isn't, then what I did here, I wanted to, and I think this is a very important, is a very important map, because it's one of the things that tells us about the nature of when you're talking about income distribution, you want to know, well, how is it distributed across space? And one of the things that this tells us is Japan is basically like a linear, it's almost like a linear country. You can just, it's like laid out on a line, you know, the way the way it's shaped. And if you can imagine, remember we've talked a little bit about how if you locate households on a line segment, where does the company, if you can move around, the cost of moving around is relatively low. Well, then the firms located in the center, remember those models? We talked about that. Well, look what happens here. This is kind of what you see when you look at this income distribution. Excuse me. at the prefecture level. You'll notice here the highest is over 90. What I did was I took the average income by prefecture, and I set Tokyo equal to 100. So Tokyo I set as the maximum equals to 100 in 2013. I wanted to look at the income distribution. You see, it's all in a line from Nagoya to Chiba. That line, that's Nagoya, Shizuoka, Kanagawa, Tokyo, and Chiba. And also Toyama, interestingly enough. There's a lot of small companies. Toyama is relatively wealthy. It has a lot of small companies out there. That's interesting. It just tells you the kind of health of the small companies in manufacturing sectors. And certainly they didn't have the Shinkansen that went out there. But then the second thing you notice is you have these, that almost all of the next tier are surrounding this here. So this is the heart of the manufacturing, right here. This is the heart of the manufacturing and the center of the media and finance. Manufacturing here, media and finance in Tokyo, highest and surrounding that. It's all just right in the center. So you've got this very clear, very clear. This is the income distribution in Japan is baked. This is what you have, and it's because the nature of the country. You have a single currency. This is what happens when you have a single currency, and it's a linear country. It's laid out like this. All of it's going to be in the center of the country. All that you see, Niigata, from Niigata down to, that's Mie, and that's Nara-ken there. And the very interesting thing is, so you get a few, you've got, that's a Yamanashi, that's Guma, is that Guma? That's Guma. But then you got Fukuoka, I'm sorry, Fukuoka, Fukushima here, then you're going up, but you can just see that it looks like that. It's just this kind of pyramid structure that's really based on location. And look how Osaka is relatively poor. You've got that's Osaka there, that's in the second lowest income category. And if you've ever looked, I don't think I have it. I think I have it here. But I've done studies of income distribution at the ku level, at the ku level in Osaka, Shi, and the 20. Compare that with the 23 wards. Incomes are 20% higher in the poorest Tokyo. The poorest kus in the Tokyo 23 wards is about equal to the most wealthy average income in Osaka. So unless people are the only other possibility is that people in Osaka lie about it, which they could be. I don't know. That's certainly possible. I mean, it's not poor, but I don't know. It is interesting. It is a lot lower. So maybe they just lied more there. Who knows? But it may be that they are significantly lower income as well. It's just a lower income and a declining manufacturing. But then you get some of the lowest here. These really kind of remote, the more remote prefectures, and Aomori, Aomori there, and Kochi, and Oita, and Miyazaki, and Kagoshima, and that's help me here. Nagasaki. That's Nagasaki. So those are the, but they're more peripheral. The further away you get from Tokyo, the incomes go down. And think about it, the reason, well, this is the center of the market. It's single it's single currency. It's just it costs more to serve. All of your industry is going to be focused in the center. It costs, you're further away, your transport costs are higher, and the currency is the same currency. It just puts these parts of the country at a real disadvantage in terms of manufacture. A lot of manufacturing, and a lot of kind of services. It's not, this is one of the arguments that you'd almost want to make. Let's say, for example, and I think at some days, countries are going to have to try to figure this stuff out and figure out how to do this, maybe do it with a Bitcoin or something. But these areas should have a separate currency. They really need a separate currency. They should have a currency, if they had a separate currency, that currency would probably relative to the currency here. Let's say that you had, this area had its own currency, and you had this, Shizuoka and Kyushu had their own currencies. You probably would be like 20% lower value, and they probably would be more prosperous because the goods would be able to price it more reasonable both on international markets as well as to sell within the country. So I mean so these are some of this is some of the problems, as you can see, your regional disparities, and in this country the regional disparity comes from just the physical structure of the country. So this is a problem. This is a problem here, that the physical structure of the country, because it's kind of like a linear line, and the line, when you have that, as we learned and as we discussed in some of the models, that you're going to you want to locate activities in the center. Well, that's what happens, and all the money and the power all flows to the center, and these peripheral regions are kind of left behind. that's a real issue. And as I say, one potential solution to that would be to have separate currencies. I figure at some point people are going to have to figure out how to do something like that. And I think you have a separate currencies here and a separate currency up here as well. And as I said, I'm just wondering with Bitcoin or something, you can figure that kind of stuff out. I don't know if Bitcoin is the answer, but I'm saying,
Is there any country use that kind of policy?
Well, no, but I think that with the kind of instant communication that you could do, your problem would be that where you have debt, your problem with that. But the great example when that happened was the reunification of Germany. That's a great example. If you want to look at what, because it went the opposite direction, where they had two different currencies: your East German Deutschmark and your West German mark, Deutschmark. That when they combined the countries, what they did was they on the balance, the assets of the East German countries were priced. They converted it directly into West German Deutschmarks, and what it did was it basically destroyed the balance sheets of all the East German countries. Balance sheets were destroyed because their liabilities became uncontrollable, and people didn't think clearly how to do it, and they took it one to one. It was a disaster. It was a disaster for the East. It still is recovering. The eastern part of Germany that was once East Germany is still recovering from that, but it was very severe early on. And a lot of companies became instantly insolvent because their balance sheets, their liabilities were the liabilities increased and the assets, the value of the assets essentially shrunk. They should have done it. It was suggested they really should have done it on a 2-to-1 basis. It should have been done on a 2-to-1 basis. So you'd have to separate it out some way, where you'd have to not unduly burden the companies that are operating there if they have debts to here. So if you're operating a company here and on your balance sheet you've got debts to entities here, you'd have to do something to where, because basically what you'd be doing is lowering the value of the currency, which means you're increasing the debt, the effective debt that's held, the debt held by those companies would increase. That's your issue. That's the issue. But the problem now is you've got this problem. You can't even set up companies. It's unattractive to set up companies there anyway. So in the long term, you would actually have a situation where it would be more attractive to have a business, there, because now, let's say for example here, you have these locations. Well, it's China right there. Shanghai is, you can almost swim to Shanghai. Not really, but it's not that far. It's pretty close. This is a lot closer to Shanghai than it is to Tokyo. It's a lot closer. So, but the problem is that stuff produced here is priced in yen too, and the income structure is lower. It's just, that's why I say you need that kind of a thing. I've done this household distribution. This is kind of hard because I think it's kind of unstable. I've done this. It's not a very satisfying. I mean, one of the things, the problem is the incomes drop a lot, and they kind of. The only thing that is you want to look at that is see the relative income, and that's what I did. I did it to do the relative income, and as I say, you can see here. I mean, Okinawa. Look how you know, it's just, Kagoshima, these are how poor these prefectures are relative to Tokyo. To Tokyo, Kanagawa, you know, all of these major, as I say, Toyama is quite well off, but once you get down pretty quickly, you know, you have, there's Osaka, look how far down Osaka is. You know, that's just not, it's not a very well off prefecture. You know, but otherwise it's kind of hard to, the comparison is not easy, and I looked at the change in income. It's kind of decreased more it tended to decrease more in the larger prefectures. You know, so you get this, the major city regions are in red, so you see there's kind of a tendency. The secondary are in green, they're kind of in the middle. And so there's a tendency, this is certainly in the Aichi and the Kanto region, there tend to be more of a decline. Let's see, then I was able to do this by city a little bit. It's, you know, I mean, one of the things here, Yokohama is high. Yokohama is higher because there's so much commuting. A lot of upper middle income people actually live in Yokohama rather than the 23 wards. You know, so that's where, let's see, I think that's it, yeah. That's good, that's where kind of where I wanted to get to. Is, so we'll go into the government and taxation next. If I get a chance, I'll update the data. Because the government's financial situation is, there were a year or two ago there was some kind of rosy, a little bit of optimistic forecasts that haven't happened. So the government is in some tough, it's in a tough kind of situation in terms of the finance. Something has to change. It's you know, something will have to change. At any rate, that's the lecture for today. So well, thank you for that, and well, let's see. I'll have some get back to work on the. I'll get some exercise questions to you. And I'll be working and catching up on that over the next couple of weeks. So I'm getting caught up on that. And I'm going to be quite gentle with the 12 to 15. Don't worry about that. That was just very helpful for me to understand where you were. So, and what was very helpful with that was that it helped me to kind of pull back a bit and make sure that you guys understood some real stuff that I think was really important. So thank you.